Hello, happy Pride Month and welcome to the June STC Roundtable on Leadership and Teams. Before we begin, I just want to give you an overview of the month. We're thinking about leadership and teams with both of those terms conceived rather broadly. So teams are any joint effort, and that could be a short-lived informal two-person collaboration or a large organizational team based on reporting structure, or a project-based cross-functional team, for example. And leadership is not about role or position, but it's really the traits and practices that are involved in using influence to inspire and guide others into action, regardless of your role or title. We're all on many teams, and we all also can participate and practice and grow in leadership behaviors. So the roundtable is 4 weeks of programming during June and programming and resources. In week 1, we'll focus mostly on teams, on how to make them more successful or useful or impactful, both to our organizations, but also to individuals, in other words, to ourselves. In the second week, we'll take a look at some tools that we can use to assess our innate personality traits and behavioral patterns and figure out how to leverage this information to increase our impact as leaders, regardless of our title. In week 3, I'll be having a live webinar that it'll be a panel, a conversation with a few veteran tech comm leaders about topics around teams, leadership, and collaboration, including things such as the importance of diversity and some tips on how to participate on or lead virtual and global teams. In week 4, we'll have a unique take in which we'll tackle, and there's a pun intended there, we'll tackle the topic of teams from a different angle. I'll be interviewing a colleague of mine at ServiceNow, Katie Ott, who plays semi-professional women's football and actually co-owns a team. And so she'll be talking about how some of the great metaphors we use about sports and teams actually really have strong parallels. So she'll be doing some comparisons between her day job and her side job, as it were. So I hope you'll join me for more of those activities, but let's jump into today's topic, which is the power of Venn, using teams to maximize our impact. So we're going to talk about a couple things today. Generally, there are 3 areas. Well, first, we'll talk about why teams are so important today and why it's worth talking about them. We'll talk about some common ways in which teams show up in technical communication. And then we'll also look at why it's important that we be more intentional, more mindful about how and when we form teams, and why this is so important to the success of teams and individuals, particularly in today's work environment. So by way of introduction, my name's Tony Mantich. I'm a Senior Director of Product Content at ServiceNow. Before I joined ServiceNow, I was at ADP. At ServiceNow, I lead a large, globally distributed team that's responsible for really all of the documentation, both textual and multimedia, that we create to support our products. At ADP, I led an information architecture and content strategy group for a similar organization. In my past, before I got into tech comm, I was studying to get my PhD in English, intending to be an academic and an educator. And when I made the switch away from that, I actually spent some time satisfying my need to teach and to be around education by teaching in the graduate program at Portland State in technical communication for about 7 years. So I've included my contact information. Please feel free to tweet or to reach out to me. I do want to make a couple disclaimers before we get started. First of all, I'm not speaking on behalf of any employer, my current employer or my previous employer, so nothing I say here really reflects any opinions of those organizations. So my thoughts here today are really my own, although they're also heavily influenced by a lot of other people, right? It's a little daunting to talk on these topics of teams and leadership because there's so much literature on these topics. So what I really hope to bring is to bring some resources to you, right? This job is described as curation. And so I want to funnel some information to you, give you some thoughts about my particular experience, but it's important to know that I'm really not an expert. I'm not a researcher who has studied leadership in teams. I'm a practitioner. I've learned a lot and continue to learn a lot from my colleagues and bosses and other authors and researchers. So I'll try to give credit where I know that the influence is really strong, but just, you know, we are the sum of our experiences. So this is more a synthesis and curation than necessarily original material. Also, the roundtable is really about stirring up thoughts and providing resources and fostering communication and sharing of ideas. And so I hope you'll join in that. And one way you can join in that is by participating in the Roundtable Forum, which is an online discussion board. And there are areas for each of the roundtables. So if you visit that forum, you'll see some opportunities to get in conversations that have happened previously. And then I'll be putting up some prompts for topics related to what we're covering this month as well. So I hope you'll check that out. I'll put up the link at the end of the presentation as well. So when we talk about teams, I wanted to start by thinking about why it's important to focus on teams. Again, broadly conceiving that as any manner of joint endeavor, ranging from simple collaborations to complex organizations. And if you do a search on Amazon or the short shelf at your local bookstore, you'll see that a lot of authors and experts have done a lot of thinking and writing about teams for a long time. But I think it's also a really important time to think anew about teams. And that's one of the reasons I was so excited to be asked by STC to curate this conversation this month. So some of the reasons I think the topic is particularly relevant today include that the nature of work is changing. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We not only have to constantly adapt to new realities and ways of working, but we're at a point in time where the very nature, I think, of teams and teamwork and collaboration is changing, and they're literally becoming more prevalent and important. So teams are proliferating, and the emphasis on collaboration is higher, I think, than it's ever been. If you're like me, your calendar will probably attest to this. So I know my calendar, if I look at it, is overrun with meetings. And even though I work remotely, I'm very rarely, at least during the regular business day, working alone in a very literal sense. So teams and collaboration are really important. And here's some research to back that up. Here's a quote from an article that was posted on Microsoft.com, but was really drawing on research that was published by HBR, the Harvard Business Review. And it indicates that not only are we doing collaborative work most of the business day, but we're also literally on more teams than we used to be. This research suggesting that we're on twice as many teams as we were 5 years ago. And it's not just that we're on more teams, but the nature of teams are changing too. So there's been a lot of people writing and thinking about the quote unquote future of work these days. So if you Google that, you'll see articles by Deloitte, McKinsey, and IBM, and a whole bunch of others, including an article that was on Forbes.com by my boss. And in that article, he paints a picture of the changing landscape and how teams themselves will actually organize and function differently. So those teams will be empowered to make more decisions, he suggests, and will be less hierarchical, more self-managed. And even the way the work that those teams do will be identified will be different. So teams may spring up on their own or may create their own kind of backlog about based on what needs are emerging. And so these will change the way we structure our teams, the way we form our teams. And so just a really hot topic these days, thinking about how teams are changing. So let's break down in a little more detail some of the causes for these changes. I think there's three overriding trends that are causing them. One is what's sometimes called the fourth industrial revolution, the coming of artificial intelligence and machine learning, or as we sometimes say in the business world, the digital transformation. is one, but I think another is generational changes that are happening, which is always true, right? But we see Generation Z, which is the first kind of native tech generation, and that's impacting things as well. So let's break that down a little bit more, some of the ways that work is changing. One is that work is more technologically enabled, and that has a couple of impacts. One is that as workplaces go through digital transformation and introduce AI and machine learning, technology is taking on some tasks that we previously did, that humans previously did. And so that means humans are being pushed more and more into some of the higher level creative human high value work, and that work is very, very often collaborative and requires teamwork. Another way that technology is influencing this is because it's simply providing new tools that enable collaboration. So even if you're globally distributed, work is just more collaborative now, and sometimes this is to take advantage of multiple specialties and skills and viewpoints, to add diversity so that we get more perspectives, and this is all really critical to innovation. And one of the ways that we often end up collaborating is by being cross-functional. And these two things are related but not the same. So you can do collaboration that is not cross-functional. Cross-functional allows us to have different practitioners in different disciplines work together at the same time rather than in sequence. So for example, in TechComm, rather than having a waterfall model where TechComm often ends up at the end, that could mean, you know, a technical communicator being embedded on an agile team and being involved from the very beginning. And so this not only creates better products because you've got people thinking about it from all angles at the same time, but also efficiencies because you're getting a head start on thinking about your phase of the work and being able to do some of that in parallel. Work is also more distributed and certainly globally, right? So geographically distribute, and this is enabled by technology, but it also allows access to better talent because you're not tied in by the limits of geography and lower costs. But you know, the downside is also results in fewer meetings with everybody in the room, fewer face-to-face interactions. And the same is true about remote work. And I include this as a different category because you can have remote employees even if you're not widely geographically distributed in this day and age. And this, like distribution, reduces costs and attracts talent, but it can also boost in performance, right? There are studies that show that people who work at home, for example, in some situations are excelling more than people who are in the office or being more productive in certain ways. But there, again, the downside is fewer face-to-face meetings. Also, the teams are more diverse now, right? We know that teams that are diverse in terms of age and generation, gender, ethnicity, experience, perspective, teams that are diverse yield better results, better products, better decisions because they've considered multiple points of view and multiple experiences. And then simply the competitive nature. The way that markets are becoming more and more competitive is putting a big pressure to be more innovative and to move with greater velocity, and teams can help with both of those things. And teams help not just because they provide more manpower, but again because of those efficiencies and because of the multiple perspectives and diversity they bring that foster innovation. So another reason I think it's important to talk about teams right now is because to be frank, I think we can do better. I think we can work better on teams and collaborate better. And I'm not alone in this. A lot of that massive literature I mentioned earlier, including the canonical book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, talk about the ways in which we're failing and offer all manner of analyses of where we go wrong and how we can improve. But they don't often address one of the foundational problems, which is, as organizations, despite all of our talk about collaboration and high-performing teams, we don't, in my opinion, build in enough support and incentive to engender and drive really excellent collaboration and teamwork. So I think there are some things we can do to address this. So some of the places I think we can do better are being more intentional about how we form and work on teams. And this really means, not collaborating or creating a team just for the sake of it. It also means picking the right types of teams. I don't know about your experience, but I've been in organizations where we tended to over create teams. We tended to spawn a team for every idea we had. We might have a lot of task forces, some of which didn't have very clear mandates or weren't properly staffed or really didn't have a kind of urgent agenda or need or a clear sense of purpose. So we really want to be intentional about how and why and we create teams. I think we have to create better support and training for collaborative practices. So I think I think sometimes we assume it's common sense how to collaborate, and I don't think that's true. I think we need to stop assuming that working on teams is just common sense or natural or table stakes, and really be intentional about providing training and tools, including assessments about natural leadership traits, including coaching about how to lead teams, how to work on teams. So I think those are areas we can do better. I think we also have to spread the teamwork and collaboration load. There's research, including some recent articles in HBR, that talk about the fact that even though we're in this collaborative environment, there tends to be a small percentage of people who are really the collaboration superstars and do a lot of the collaboration or are most effective at that collaboration. And so, for example, HBR says that up to a third of value-added collaborations come from only 3 to 5% of employees. There's also, interestingly, some research that suggests that women bear a greater part of collaborative work. So I think we can do better by spreading the teamwork more, right? And one of the ways we can do that is by doing better job of incentivizing and rewarding teamwork. One of the realities I think we face is that performance goals, the ways that we set goals for individuals and evaluate people, are often based on individual goals or done in an individual way. And we need to do a better job of building collaboration and teamwork into expectations and actually measuring the effectiveness of how people work collaboratively and build that into performance reviews. We talk a lot about being collaborative and teamwork and east-west collaboration or working horizontally, but I don't think we measure it and reward it and make it part of performance conversations. And here's one real expert talking about this, right? Because we don't provide the right training or the right incentive, we're not being as successful, or only a proportion, small percentage of our folks are really doing a great job of this. So even though we talk about collaboration a lot, we hope for collaboration, we are rewarding something different. So one author talked about we need to do what they do in sports, which is to track assists just as much as we track goals. So the other reason I think we should talk about teams is because they provide a way for us to increase our impact. And this is at both the organizational level. Clearly the reason, all the reasons I just mentioned are about teams making organizations more successful. But this also applies to individuals. So one of the reasons we as individual workers should be invested in learning how to work better on teams is because it impacts our own performance, right? It can increase our sphere of influence, for example. One of the ways it does this is by helping us to create more connections. So my bullets are out of order here for some reason, but one thing that one of the ways that this happens is by fostering creativity and innovation. At the group level and the individual level, again, the exposure to other ideas, the working together, some of the energy and engagement that comes out can be really powerful. Teams also provide learning opportunities, and this is really important when we think about the growth of individuals through their career. So Whereas we might not put a relatively young employee or somebody who's new to an organization on a high-risk project as an individual. The team offers a bit of a safety net and allows us to put people of different experience levels together, and allows those early in career people to get exposure to maybe more high-risk projects in a safe environment where the team can help supplement their experience and provide some guidance. It also obviously provides exposure to ideas and people, right? So you get the benefits of multiple perspectives and multiple ideas. And then it also creates opportunities for unplanned discoveries and connections. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about connections lately, and I think this is really, really powerful. So it's not just about having opportunities to be on different projects, but it's also about making those serendipitous discoveries of things being connected, because you as an individual may be participating in two teams that are doing significantly different things, but you might be able to see a connection between them. And that's actually the way that a lot of innovation happens, is by connecting ideas that seem to be separate. And then there's also connections to people as well, which has obvious benefits. So let's turn for a minute and look at teams and collaboration in the technical communication landscape. So here's the lone tech writer, which I think is a myth. The lone tech writer might be somebody who's not on a writing team, is the only writer in an organization. But as I mentioned elsewhere, technical writing is inherently a collaborative enterprise. So we're always working with other people, whether that be hardware or software engineers or developers or product management personnel or customers, end users. We're mediating between lots of people. That's just the nature of our job, is to translate from engineering to customers. And so we're always working with a lot of people. But let's break this down a little bit more into some of the common types of teams or collaborations a tech writer works on. So one is organizational. The writer might be on a writing team. In some cases, that might not be how writers are organized. Writers might report to individual development teams and be matrixed into a writing community. But let's assume for this model that the writer is part of a organizational writing team. And that writing team might be supporting a product or a business unit. It might be part of a larger writing department. And that department's going to exist in the larger organizational structure somewhere. In my case, we report to a design organization. Sometimes it might report to operations or marketing or other to support, so other organizations. And then we could continue to build out kind of concentric circles of organizational membership. But there are other types of membership that are team memberships and collaborations that are based on the work and not the reporting structure. So if you're an Agile house, you might be embedded on one or two or three, hopefully not more, Agile teams. And even if you're not in Agile, you might have some sort of waterfall relationship to people in a development team as well. And those are teams that are centered around particular work or product or features. If you are in a matrix organization and your boss might not be one of those writing organizations, and so you might have a different boss, and then you might also have a team that your boss may actually manage other teams as well. And so you might be part of a team that's defined by structure, but is not defined by discipline. So your boss may, let's say you're a tech writer, but your boss also manages support. And so you have a larger team there that's defined by that structure, but not by discipline. It's cross-functional in nature. You might be a member of task forces, which are usually temporary things that spin up to deal with a particular short-term project or initiative. For example, you might be on a task force that's writing your or maintaining your standard operating procedures. Or you might be on another team that's developing style guides or maintaining your style guides. So other types of projects that are coming up. And these could be either short-term, the task force tends to be a little more short-term, or ongoing, like the style guide team might be an existing team that has to continue to exist to do governance and make changes. Your organization might do peer editing, in which you might be part of a really small team of 2 where you exchange work, but that's a collaborative exercise and might be thought of as a team. There might be other working groups. I think that term is being used a lot now to talk about cross-functional teams that come together, in some ways kind of akin to the Agile model, and that they often draw people from multiple disciplines or in some sort of cross-functional or matrixed way to work on a particular problem. There might be some kind of enterprise-wide governance or other efforts going on. For example, in a previous role, I was part of an enterprise content strategy team or board that operates across an even wider cross-section of an organization. You might also be a member of certain communities of practice, and these could be teams that are not really driven by a particular project or deliverable, but are more about shared expertise and interest. So, for example, at ServiceNow, we have a taxonomy community of practice, and so that group doesn't do work per se. It's about sharing information and advancing the practice of taxonomy. If you're a manager, you might also be a part of a management team that's defined by role or by function, right? People who are people managers. There are also leadership teams which may have managers but may not be exclusive to managers. And there might even be extended leadership teams, right? So in my organization, for example, I have managers who report to me. I have a staff that includes managers and individual contributors, but I also have an extended leadership team, which includes all of the managers in my organization, as well as some other key individual contributors that help shape the strategy. So this model is a little overwhelming in that it includes a lot of different roles and kind of merges some individual contributor roles and management roles. But you get the idea that all of us are embedded on a lot of different teams and participate in a lot of different types of collaboration. And those types of collaboration exist for different reasons and have different structures. And part of what I wanted to show with this Venn diagram is that that there's real power here. There's also some danger, right? So the power comes from all of the intersections, right? There's a lot of opportunity to make cross connections and have wide influence, to literally be a connecting point between a lot of different ideas and people and activities. And this can allow us to expand the reach of collaboration and give each of us as individuals the opportunity to expand our influence across the business and across various channels. But there's a real danger here too, and the danger is around being spread too thin or losing focus. So let's break this down a little bit more. So some of the personal impacts of that Venn diagram, there are advantages and disadvantages. So one of the advantages is variety, right? So having a number of different activities can really keep engagement levels up and keep us from getting into any sort of rut. It also gives us exposure to other disciplines and functions and parts of the business, and that information can not only help us do our jobs better by having a greater understanding, for example, of the business, but also give us exposure to opportunities, to expanded networks for resources, as well as visibility, right? That gives other people visibility into the work we do, into our skills and capabilities. And you never know where that might lead. And then, you know, one of my favorites is that it really does, that kind of being at the center of that big nexus really does allow for serendipitous discoveries or connections. Some of the dangers are overcommitment, right? Being spread too thin, or one of the things that happen when you're spread too thin is that it makes it hard to do everything well. And then when that happens, there can be kind of a vicious cycle of not being able to perform as well in individual tasks and then becoming disengaged or underperforming. Another risk is that sometimes if so much of our work is done collaboratively with other teams, sometimes our individual contributions can be masked or go unrecognized. That's particularly true if you're reporting to a lot of teams that are being led by people that report to different organizations. Sometimes that feedback doesn't get back to your boss, for example. It can result in a little bit of situational ADD, right? A lack of focus just because you're being pulled in so many different directions. It can lead to burnout. It can also lead to some conflicts about prioritization or domain. If you're working with another group, there might be some kind of negotiating about boundaries, but also if you're being pulled in this many different directions, particularly if those teams are being led by people in other organizations, there might be some conflict over where you should be focusing your energy. So there can be some real challenges here. And then if you're that widely, if you're spread that thinly, you can also, there's also a danger of kind of losing your own sense of purpose and identity at work. So it's all about balance. And I think one of the things that can help us mitigate the dangers and maximize the advantages is just to really be more aware and more mindful about the groups we're participating in and why and what we're getting from them. So I do want to talk about these last two in a little more detail and put up some research around them, because I think these two are directly tied to those gaps in how we train and prepare people for working in collaborative team environments. Especially when we ask them to work collaboratively. So Lisa Kwan has a great article on what she calls the collaboration blind spot, which is really about how organizations talk a lot about collaboration, but don't prepare people to do it well. At the group level, this quote is about the group level, but I think it also applies to individuals. So we really ask people to collaborate cross-functionally, but sometimes there's some fear associated with that. It can lead some defensiveness because they feel like individuals or groups might feel like if I'm being asked to collaborate, I'm going to lose kind of my purpose or my discipline or my area of impact. And this is, I think, a totally normal and human experience. In a webinar I did a few years ago, I talked about what I called organizational ego. And I think sometimes, particularly if we're working on enterprise content initiatives, we sometimes get a little worried that our content organization might lose ground to another content organization, particularly as we start thinking about unified content strategy. So I've seen this happen. I've been guilty of it myself, right? I think it's kind of a human thing. And so all the more reason we have to train more about how to do collaboration. And one way we can deal with this is to really continue to reinforce what individuals and individual groups value is. And so I recommend this article because it gives some concrete antidotes to dealing with this problem. So let's move on to talk a little bit about how to be mindful about how we form teams so that we can, which I think can help mitigate some of these dangers that I've been talking about. So with the rest of our time, I want to focus on just one area of this, which is how we form teams. There's a ton of literature about teams and leadership and how to avoid pitfalls and how to communicate better, how to assign roles and work. But this part about knowing when to form teams and how to form them and how to get them off to a good start, I think is sometimes neglected a little bit. And I do have a double entendre on this slide when I talk about forming teams with intent. On the one hand, we need to make sure that our teams have a purpose, right? Those teams have their own intent, but I also mean that we need to be more mindful, have more intent as we're forming those teams. So we need to realize that teams are not one size fits all. And so I just want to run quickly through some steps and some considerations to keep in mind when we're forming teams in order to allow us to avoid needless proliferation of teams and to make sure those teams are more effective. And I'm going to start by thinking about this from the point of view of somebody creating a team, a leader or a sponsor or a project manager. But there are corollaries to think about if you're being asked to join a team as well. So first, it's important to think about why the team is needed. Sometimes that's for administrative or operational reasons. These are your team's based on organizational structure, or sometimes they're in order to provide performance support and manage policies and do communication. Sometimes you form a team because you simply need more hands, right? You need more capacity to deal with something. And a good example of this is the bucket brigade, right? Or barn raising activity. These are teams where it's not really about pulling together specific skills, it's really about capacity. Sometimes you do, however, need to bring together a very specific mix of skills in order to be successful. So a good example of this is a surgical team, right? You need somebody who, you need a nurse to manage the instruments, and you need the surgeon, the primary surgeon, to do the cutting and the work, and you need an anesthesiologist, right? You need people with very specific skills. You can't just call in whoever's available, and it also doesn't help to just add numbers in that situation. You need very specific things. Sometimes the team's created to increase efficiency and quality, and this is in this case, you still need skills. This is kind of a mix of the previous two, in that you do need specific skills, but you're also trying to increase capacity. Sometimes the point of the team is to increase agility by having more people on call, or velocity, or resiliency, right? If you've got a team of people working on a project and one person goes out for some unexpected reason, there's a better chance of being able to adapt to that situation quickly. Sometimes the point of the team is to bring in that diversity of perspectives in order to be creative and innovate. Often teams are spun up to deal with a particular short-term problem or complete a specific project, whereas at other times teams are going to be more standing teams that some of these other categories sometimes are ongoing teams. And then sometimes there's also, you spin up teams to increase employee engagement. I don't think this is very often the primary reason or only reason, but some of these reasons can overlap and work together. So just a few points I want to reiterate, right? Not all work is made better by teamwork. Some things it's still appropriate and even better to do individually. Two heads are not always better than one. And at bottom, every team should have a clear sense of why a team is needed, why it's useful to bring together multiple people. What are the benefits of being a team? And then the team should use that understanding to think about who's on the team and how the team functions. So moving on, after you've thought about why you need a team, that can help inform what type of team is needed. And again, I've just cataloged a few different considerations you need to think about when we're structuring teams. So one is duration. Is it for a fixed period, or is it a standing ongoing team? And is that going to be a long commitment or a short commitment? Does the team need to be co-located? And if so, do they need to be co-located with other team members or with certain stakeholders? Can they be distributed? Can they be virtual? What are the criteria for membership? Going back to the previous slide, right? Do you need specific skills? And if so, what are they? Or experience levels? And what's the right size for the team, right? You want the team to be large enough to meet some of the other requirements and get the benefits of being a team, but also be small enough to be efficient. I do think we sometimes have a problem of having bloated teams because we're trying to be inclusive, or we feel like there are lots of people who need to know what's going on. And I think sometimes some of those teams could be reduced to more of a core team and then have a communications model so that stakeholders are getting the information they need. Need to think about the type and degree of leadership. So is it going to be a formal team? Is it going to be hierarchical in terms of leadership? It's going to be centralized. And then what's the nature of the work? Is it project-based? Is it informational? Is it a team that's around sharing information? Is it domain-based? Is it operational? So there's something that will continue over time. And then what are some key aspects of the structure and what are some of the roles you need? So one example that's useful to talk about here is goes back to that question of who should be on the team. As organizations grow and we get more cross-functional, sometimes when we create teams, we tend to want to invite a lot of people to them, and we need to think about who to invite based on how the team's going to work. And so if the team is about making decisions, right, and moving things along as a strategic team, you want to make sure you've got people on the team who are empowered to make those decisions. But you also might need to think about having a representative model where key stakeholder groups that need to be involved in those decisions, or at least be aware of those decisions, have representatives on the team as well. So rather than having whole teams, sub-teams, in some cases you just need a representative, and then you need to have processes that say your role is to be a liaison and take information back to your larger organizations. So so once we've covered why we need the team and what type of team we need, then we also need to make sure that we have a really clear articulation of the purpose of the team. And this needs to include what Simon Sinek in his book Start With Why and Find Your Why talks about as the what and the how and the why. And according to Sinek, we're pretty good at determining the what. That's some of what we just covered about, what is the team going to do, and even the how, which is, how it's structured and how we work. But sometimes we miss the why, and the why is really a fundamental motivating principle. And so it's really important to have a charter or some sort of articulation of all three of these aspects of what Sinek calls the golden circle. Once you have those things, you also need to select your team with care. So consult all of those requirements that we just covered in the first three steps to make sure that you're making invitations that are suited to those requirements. And again, that includes having the right people to make decisions so that the team can work effectively and not have a lot of back and forth with stakeholders. But it's also really important to include the overall portfolio of the people you're inviting to the team. And that's partly to make sure that those people aren't spread too thin, right? To make sure that they're not overcommitted, but also to see where there are opportunities where the fact that, Tom is also on the style guide team will bring expertise besides, in addition to his role as a member of the Associate Resource Group for Latin America. Look at the individual mix, look at those Venn diagrams because that can really impact the effectiveness of the representatives on the team. But it's also about making sure that workloads are, that folks have bandwidth to stay engaged and be optimally effective. And also avoid always relying on the usual suspects. And this is really a tough thing to do in some cases, particularly if you've got highly strategic projects. And you tend to go to the same, you tend to draft the same people either because they're super innovative or they're really good at collaboration or they know a lot of information or because they tend to volunteer a lot. But it's really important, right? This is one of the key aspects of managerial leadership is to realize, to load balance, right? To seek out and that's both to keep everybody optimally engaged, but it's also to provide growth opportunities to all of our colleagues. And then be sure to communicate when you are inviting people, considering people for the team, communicate the purpose as well as the likely degree and length of commitment up front. And then lastly, tailor the process based on all of the things that we've talked about. So the structure and the processes should be based on the what and the how and the why. Where appropriate, which is most cases in my opinion, it's good to let the team determine the process based on the purpose and not the why. and the team membership. But as the team's done that, whether a leader determines that or is done more democratically, the critical thing is to clearly articulate that so that everybody agrees on what the purpose is, but also on how you're going to work together. How are you going to communicate? How are you going to make decisions? And a lot of this you can pick up if you want more resources on this in books on leadership, but also resources around project management often have a lot of good information about this. Also talk about roles so that people understand their particular roles on the team. You might do a RACI chart, which talks about RACI standing for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, and indicating which team members and which stakeholders beyond the team fall into each of those categories. And then set clear expectations about individual contributions, and the RACI chart can help with that as well. And then provide some support, some training and resources around how to work collaboratively together. Do some team building exercises. Think about how people's individual skills come together to make the team effective. So those are, that's one look at some considerations, some steps to go through to think about as we're forming teams. But I also want to now pivot and think about this from an individual point of view for a little bit, and how the things that we've talked about here today can help you take control of your own assignments, right? Your own team assignments and collaboration. And help us each to be more mindful about our roles on teams and how to maximize that. And so, so going back to the Venn diagram, I would encourage you to think about your own portfolio of work and portfolio of team memberships. And you might do this as a list, or it might be useful to try to draw it as a diagram, a Venn diagram. In my experience, it's really hard to do the Venn diagram with complete accuracy because it's hard to get all the overlapping right, but you can still get a sense of all the overlaps, the things that you're at the center of, all the things that overlap in your world. And that might help you to visualize ways that those things can support each other or connections that you can make. But it might also indicate to you that you're how thinly you're spread, or it might help to visualize how much diversity there is in your portfolio. And there's no right or wrong about what diversity should be there. Are most of your teams centered around writing? Do you have some that are not, that are more based on culture, associate resource group or something? And again, there's no right answer there, but it's just useful to look at what you're doing and what the cross implications of that are, and if you want to work toward making any changes there. Obviously, this is probably something to work with your manager or leadership around as well, particularly as you're thinking about career goals and educational opportunities for growth. So here are some specific questions you might use as you look in the organizational mirror, as it were. Do you know the why and the what and the how for each of the teams or collaborative efforts that show up in that map for you? Do you know what each of those is trying to do? And then do you understand your role in that effort, right? Are you the right person to be on each team, or one of the right people? What particular value are you adding or receiving by being on that team? But also, what particular value are you receiving? And if you don't feel like there's a good match there, it might be worth considering if there's a better assignment for you, or if you want to work to kind of change your commitments. But also take a look at the diagram as a whole and see where there are opportunities to really use the power of Venn, right, to make connections between all of the things that you're involved with. So I hope that some of you will think about that. I hope this is a useful model, or there have been some useful ideas here. And if there are, or even if there aren't, I encourage you to chime in on the forum. So I've put already in the leadership and teams forum, on the Roundtable forum area, a couple of questions. One about evaluating how well your organization collaborates and supports collaboration and teamwork. Another about how are you organized, right? What are you part of a writing team, or are you embedded on a development team, or both? Is your writing organization embedded in a product organization or in a marketing organization? Those kinds of questions. And then there's a question that looks forward to next week that asks about leadership and personality assessments. So these are things like Strength Finders by Gallup, or the Myers-Briggs test, or other assessments like that help you identify kind of natural tendencies, and some questions there about whether you've done any of those, and how you might have used that to change the way you work on teams. With that, just a reminder about where we are. We talked about teams today. Next week, we'll talk about some of those assessments like Myers-Briggs and others like them, like StrengthsFinders, and how we can leverage what we learn from those to be more effective as individuals and teams. In week 3, we'll have that panel, and week 4, we'll have an interview. And with that, I thank you for joining. I hope this recording was more successful than the first one. And here are a few references. It'll be in the slide deck to some of the things I referred to, as well as a link to another resource on the Roundtable, which is there's a page that has a list of resources that are related to the things that we're talking about. So there are already some links up for online resources and at least one book on the topics we talked about today, and then we'll be adding to that list of resources every week. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to hearing from some of you by Twitter or email, or hopefully on the Roundtable forum. Thanks so much.